You get all wild there, girl. Hi, guys. Welcome. Bruce, thank you for welcoming everybody. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, True Crime and Felines. Extreme close-up. For those that are new here, my name is Brandy, and I bring you a true crime case or mystery every Friday with one or more of my fabulous felines. For my returning subscribers, welcome back, my feline friends. And a big shout out to my feline fans who are members of this channel. I appreciate your support. So this week's case might be a little bit difficult for some. This 10-year-old child, it's about a child who took her first life at 10 years old. And that wasn't the only life she took. And before you say it was probably an accident, it wasn't. This little girl, this child, purposefully and with intent took 2 lives before she was even a preteen. So, let's get started. Mary Flora Bell was born May 26, 1957 in Corbridge, Northumberland, England. Mary's mother, Betty, was a prostitute by trade, and she was pretty young herself. See, she was only 17 when Mary was born, and Mary was her second child. Now, Betty never seemed to want or care about Mary at all from the very beginning. After Mary was born and the hospital staff attempted to place Mary in Betty's arms, Betty looked at the staff in disgust and said, "Get that thing away from me." As for Mary's father, Mary believed her father was a man named William Bell. Now, William was a violent drunk and criminal with an arrest record that included armed robbery. William had married Betty shortly after Mary was born, so Mary believed that's who her father was. But most say William was not her father, and really, who knows with Betty's choice of career. Regardless, William would be the one to actually look after Mary most of the time when he was present and wasn't out committing crimes and wasn't at the bar. Most of the time she was alone. Betty would actually leave her children in the care of William while she took off to Glasgow for more lucrative clients. And she'd be gone for weeks sometimes. Now, the times that Mary was left alone with her mother, certain, accidents would start happening, and it would cause injury to Mary. It started out with what the family thought that Mary was just not being properly watched as a toddler, and she would get into things that she wasn't supposed to and then get hurt. But it kind of escalated from there. In 1960, when Mary was 3 years old, Mary fell out of a 1-story window. Witnesses would state that they saw Betty dropping her out the window. And on another occasion, Mary accidentally ingested a whole bunch of sleeping pills that she apparently had got into. However, the family always said the sleeping pills were put up where the kids couldn't get them. So they suspected she had help in that area. And it was kind of well known that Betty would regularly drug up Mary to get her to sleep so she wasn't a bother to Betty. Now, eventually, as these accidents kept happening, Betty's family began to wonder, was Betty actually trying to kill Mary and make it look like an accident? So they wanted to kind of save Mary, and they reached out to Betty and said that they would take Mary into their custody, but Betty would refuse. But then they got confused because Betty actually ended up selling Mary to a very unstable woman across town who didn't have any children. And Mary's older sister, Catherine, who was only about 6 or 7 herself, had to walk across town alone to claim Mary and bring her back home. Now, Mary's aunt, Betty's sister, really got involved and said, "Look, I will take Mary off your hands." This is getting ridiculous. But Betty kept refusing over and over every time that the offer was presented to her. And it was really confusing because you just sold her to somebody. So why, what's going on? Betty didn't want to give Mary up because Mary started becoming a moneymaker for her. See, it was alleged that Betty started selling Mary to her clients. And Mary was only 5 years old. So now that Mary was a moneymaker, she didn't want to give Mary up. Betty was also known as far as being a prostitute, she was also kind of a dominatrix in her line of work. And Mary would often, witness her mother with these clients, choking them, inflicting pain. And allegedly, according to Mary years later, Betty started offering Mary as part of the package of this whole dominatrix thing at times, for a hefty fee. So, with the witnessing and allegedly being a part of this, Mary began kind of copying her mother's behavior with the children her own age. So obviously, by the time Mary started school, she was showing signs of very unstable and disturbed and unpredictable behavior. She would frequently get in fights with her schoolmates, physical fights, both boys and girls, and she would always attempt to strangle or suffocate them. In one fight, she held a girl down and she shoved sand in her mouth in an attempt to, block her windpipe. In another fight, Mary somehow got a hold of a lit cigarette and she ended up putting the cigarette out on the girl's face. Gee, I wonder where she learned this behavior. Now, her classmates would state that they learned kind of Mary's behavior and they learned when Mary was going to strike and become violent. That she would show physical signs, that she would start shaking her head and she would form this steely glaze and she would stare down the person that she was going to attack. So they were able to kind of avoid her and get away from her before her violent tendencies would come out. So due to this quick temper and violent behavior, children just stopped socializing with Mary. They were like, we don't want anything to do with you. And that didn't help much in Mary's situation. She became more isolated. That was until she met Norma Bell. Now, Norma Bell was the granddaughter of the next door neighbor of Mary. And she was about 2.5 years older than Mary. Now, although Norma's last name was Bell as well, there was no relation. It was just a coincidence. So here we have Mary, this dominant, unstable, violent girl. And here's Norma, a somewhat submissive, quiet girl, doing whatever Mary said. This is not a good combination. So Mary is now 10 years old at this point, and her violent behavior is escalating. In May of 1968, a young boy was found kind of wandering the street, and he looked dazed and he was bleeding from the head. He was given medical attention, and then the police had asked him what had happened. And he had told them that he was playing with Mary and Norma Bell on top of this air raid shelter, which is about 7 feet from the ground, that they were on the roof. And as he looked over the edge, somebody from behind pushed him and he fell 7 feet and hit his head. And he told police he didn't know which girl had pushed him, but we probably know who pushed him. Now, later that same day, police would get a mother coming into the station and complaining that she had 3 small girls, her daughters, and that they were playing with Mary and Norma Bell earlier that day in a sandbox area, and that Mary and Norma attempted to strangle them. So police rounded up Mary and Norma and they asked him about the incident. Mary would completely deny about knowing anything about what they were talking about. Again, I believe this was learned behavior from home. Deny. However, Norma ended up telling the police that Mary just simply posed a question to the girls, and that Mary said, "What happens when you choke someone? Do they die?" And then Mary just grabbed one of the girls around the throat and started choking them. The girls started to turn purple, and Norma told the police that she told Mary to stop, which Mary did. But Mary wasn't done. She then went on to the next girl and did the same thing until she turned purple, and then she went on to the next girl and did the same thing till she turned purple. And Norma told the police that all 3 times she told Mary to stop, and Mary did. Now, years later, one of these girls would come forward, talk to the press, whatever, and they would state that Norma was actually holding her down in the sand while Mary was on top of her, choking her. And Norma never mentioned that to police, that she was holding anybody down, which, of course, as a kid, you're not going to admit that. But it does make me wonder, as we go through this story, that maybe Norma is not as innocent as she portrays herself to be. Now, the police just kind of spread to local authorities that, Mary is this little girl. She kind of has violent behaviors. So just an FYI going forward. And since Mary and Norma were so young at the time, 10 and 12, that the police just warned them, be nice to your friends and just let them go. Now, I'm sure the police were well aware of Mary's kind of background because both her parents had seen a police officer a time or two. So they probably felt sorry for her. And they probably thought that these were just kind of isolated incidents. Unfortunately, they would be wrong. So to give you some context, in the 1960s in this area, England was going through this kind of urban renewal project. And there were several buildings and houses in the areas that were actually being demolished to make room for new, modern buildings and flats and all that stuff. So there were several rundown buildings and abandoned rundown houses in the area that were labeled for demolition. And all the children in this impoverished area would actually play around and in these abandoned houses and buildings and in the demolition site. So that was kind of their playground. Well, on May 25th, 1968, a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was actually found in one of these abandoned houses. Now, Martin was found on his back. His arms were up above his head, and he had specks of blood and foam around his mouth. And there was a bottle of painkillers, kind of up by his head, that were actually, they weren't his or weren't brought there. It was left over from when the house was abandoned. So a local workman named John found Martin in the house, and he actually was attempting to give him CPR. But unfortunately, Martin was already gone. But while John was giving CPR to this little Martin, 2 girls appeared in the doorway of the house peeking in, and John stated that they were Mary and Norma Bell, and he had quickly shooed them away because he didn't want them to see Martin. So after they were shooed away from the house, Mary and Norma actually went to Martin's aunt's house and knocked on the door. When Martin's aunt answered, she stated that one of your sister's kids had an accident, and we think it's Martin. He's over there in that house, but I couldn't tell because he was just covered in blood. Well, obviously we already know that Martin wasn't covered in blood, and Mary has exaggerated that point. So an autopsy was performed on Martin, and there were no signs of violence anywhere on the body that they could tell. And that he was able to rule out that Martin didn't ingest any of those painkillers, so that's not what killed him either. The ruling was that the death was suspicious because they couldn't really figure out what happened to this poor boy, but they ruled it an accident based on the dangers of the environment, because these kids were playing pretty much in a construction demolition site. So they kind of said that he died of fright maybe, or something like that. So it was kind of ruled an accident at the time. They also didn't mention the painkillers being found because they weren't the cause of his death and was just kind of trash there. So that was never mentioned to the public either. So the next day after all that happened, on May 26th, which was actually Mary's 11th birthday that day, her and Norma decided to break into a nursery school and completely vandalize it. So they overturned desks, they tore up books, they smeared ink and paint all over the walls. They also left some handwritten notes. There were 4 in total, and they kind of claimed responsibility for the death of Martin Brown. 3 of the notes had, like cuss words on them, but they kind of did not a very good job because the cuss words were misspelled a lot of the time. The first note said, "I murder so that I may come back," whatever that means. The second note said, "We did murder Martin, F off you, B." The other one said, "Fooch off, we murder, watch out, Fanny," and slur for homosexual. And then the other ones that said, "You are mice. Why? Because we murdered Martin, go Brown. You bet. Look out. There are murders about by Fanny," and again, slur word, "you screws." For context, a fanny is a British slur word for female genitalia. Now, the police took these notes as like childish pranks because it was obvious that somebody young, childish wrote them. So they really didn't think like there was a connection between Martin Brown and these notes. So no follow-up was done. Crazy. Will you calm down? So on May 29th, right before Martin's funeral, Mary and Norma apparently were daring each other to go to Martin's house and play a game called Chicken, where they would just try to one-up each other, I guess. And so they knocked on the door, and Martin's mother answered, and Norma had asked to see Martin. Now, Martin's mother had replied, "You can't see Martin because he's deceased," whereupon Mary responded with, "Yeah, I know he's dead. I want to see him in his coffin." So Martin's mother promptly just shut the door in the 2 girls' faces, and apparently Mary won that game of chicken. So a little over a month later, on July 31st, Brian Howe, who was a 3-year-old, went missing. Brian was last seen outside his house that morning playing with one of his siblings, the family dog, and Mary and Norma Bell. So friends and family would end up searching late into the night, and about 11 p.m. that night they did find Brian. And unfortunately, he was deceased. They found Brian's body between these 2 large concrete blocks in the construction demolition area where the kids played. Now, authorities were called, and what they observed at the scene right away is that someone had a deliberate but feeble attempt at hiding the body. See, there was grass and weeds kind of pulled and put on top of the body, but it was a very bad attempt. Brian's lips were actually purple. He had several bruises and scratches kind of on and around his neck, and there was a pair of scissors that were bent that were lying at his feet. It was concluded by the evidence at the scene that someone had actually strangled Brian. He was also missing his pants too, and there were lots of puncture wounds and cuts on his legs. Hair had been cut from his scalp, and his genitals were partially mutilated. And there was a very crude attempt of someone trying to make an M, carve out an M on his stomach. There are also numerous gray and maroon fibers on his body and his shoes. The coroner stated that because of the amount of force that was used to do this to Brian, it wasn't very forceful. It wasn't an adult did not do this. A child had done this. So this prompted this kind of large-scale manhunt. Over 100 detectives were put onto the case, and more than 1,200 children were questioned about it. Now, of course, Mary and Norma Bell were questioned because they were last seen playing with Brian that morning. Now, Mary and Norma admitted that yes, they were there playing with Brian that morning, but they had left and had not seen him after lunchtime. So they had no idea what happened to him. Now, during this questioning of Mary and Norma, it was noted that Mary was like very observant at the time. Like she was really watching the adults, and she was strangely calm too. And that there were times that she just seemed bored and she wasn't really saying much either. She was saying very little. Now, Norma was noted as being a little bit more excitable or like kind of on edge a little bit. But again, Norma never said anything that really stood out to the investigators. So they let the girls go, and then like the next day they decided to question Mary again because she was just acting a little strange. Wouldn't you know, she started remembering some things. And she stated that she did remember that in the afternoon, you know, after she said they never saw him after lunchtime, that Brian was playing with this older 8-year-old boy, and that 8-year-old boy, she saw him hitting Brian. She also went on to say, you know, just all this stuff coming back to her that she's remembering, that 8-year-old boy had a pair of scissors too. And that he saw the boy trying to cut a cat's tail, but that the scissors had a bent, like they were bent, so it wasn't working. So this 8-year-old boy that Mary named, he was questioned and his family was questioned, and it was determined that this boy was nowhere around the crime scene for like 3 days. He was actually, the family had gone on holiday, and he actually was at the airport the day that this murder happened. Now, the lead inspector knew that Mary knew more than she was saying because, again, they didn't put the scissors, finding the scissors out into the public. And so Mary knew about these scissors, so they're thinking, you know, she's got to have something to do with this. Now, a couple days later, on August 4th, Norma's parents actually contacted the police, and they stated that they were going to bring Norma in because Norma knew what happened to Brian. So they brought Norma in, and Norma began telling her story that Mary had come to her house and got her and said, you need to come with me and look at this. And Mary took Norma to Brian's body in between the concrete blocks. And Mary then would tell a story to Norma of how she strangled Brian and how she truly, truly enjoyed it, and then inflicted cuts on his body using the scissors until they bent, and then she went and found a razor blade and used that. Now, no razor blade was found at the scene, so Norma explained that Mary hid the razor blade, and she took authorities right to where Mary hid it, and they did find a razor blade. The authorities asked Norma to, like, could you draw what you saw? When you saw Brian, can you draw a picture of Brian? So Norma did, and she drew all the wounds that he had, and they were pretty much spot on the wounds that Brian actually had. So they kind of pressed Norma a little bit further, and Norma finally kind of broke down and admitted that, okay, so she was there when Brian was murdered, but it was all Mary. That Mary had lured Brian away from the front of his house, took him to this demolition construction site, pushed him down in the grass, and just started choking him. And I guess Mary was, you know, her hands got tired or whatever, and so she had turned to Norma and said, my hands are tired, you need to take over. And at that point, Norma said she just ran away because she was scared. So while Norma's telling this story, some of the, you know, forensic evidence is coming back, and the fibers found on Brian's body, there were maroon and gray fibers. The maroon fibers belong to clothing by Norma, and the gray fibers belong to clothing by Mary. Now, investigators would state later that the same gray fibers that were Mary's clothes was found on Martin Brown's body as well. So they started kind of thinking Mary had something to do with Martin's death. So they started questioning several children just about Mary. Now, what the children would state was that Mary would always point to the house where Martin Brown was found, and she would say, I'm the murderer, and that's where I killed. However, because Mary liked to lie and exaggerate and, just overall bring attention to herself, many of the children didn't believe her. But police were able to get some schoolwork that Mary had done right after Martin Brown was murdered, and apparently the assignment is to draw a picture of what you did that weekend. Mary had drawn a picture of finding Martin's body, and she drew a picture of Martin's body, and next to Martin's head she drew a tablet, the painkillers. Now remember, the public wasn't told about the painkillers because that was not the cause of death. And John, the guy who was doing CPR on Martin, stated that there was no way that Mary and Norma saw those painkillers from the doorway they were standing in before they were shooed away. So they pull Mary in, and they first talk to Mary about Norma's accusations about Brian. They started kind of, poking holes in Mary's initial story that she told, and initial denial, stuff like that. And Mary became very, very defensive and angry. And she told authorities that they were trying to brainwash her and she was going to get a lawyer. Now, reminder, this is an 11-year-old child saying this. This is not an adult. So again, learned behavior. So on August 7th, Brian's funeral was held, and what they do is they take the casket from the house, and it's carried in a funeral procession to the graveyard. And when this was happening, the casket appeared out of Brian's house, and apparently Mary was standing on the street, and she was laughing and rubbing her hands together. She was very proud of what she had allegedly done. The lead investigator that was actually in attendance of this funeral witnessed this and saw Mary laughing and rubbing her hands together, and he thought to himself, I've got to bring her in. She is going to go hurt someone else. So that evening, Mary and Norma were rounded up and brought into the police station. Norma broke down crying over this, and she said she never did anything and that she was going to pay them back for, bringing her in like this. As for Mary, she was fine. She actually said, fine by me. Mary then prepared a written statement where she admitted that she was present for Brian's murder, but she didn't do it. Norma did. So now they're blaming each other for it. But Mary did admit that her and Norma broke into the nursery school and vandalized it and left the notes too. So they started looking closer at Martin Brown. Now, both girls ended up having psychological evaluations because of their age. Now, Norma's results came back that she was a little intellectually delayed and that she had a very submissive character, which we kind of already knew this. Mary's results is that she was actually bright and very cunning. Although Mary did not suffer from a mental disorder, she did suffer from psychopathic personality disorder. She was a psychopath. Being a psychopath, she was incapable of remorse, and she had some social techniques that were very primitive. So her personality would, take form in kind of this automatic denial. Everything was an automatic denial for her. She would influence others by coming across as likable at first and then kind of pulling you in. And she was manipulative. She was a bully and, of course, violent. Now, there was some talk that Mary had some slight brain damage from the abuse she suffered as a child from her mother as well. So the trial started on December 5th, and they both pleaded not guilty through their lawyers. I'll remind you, these are, at this time, they're 11 and 13-year-old girls. So Norma testified in her own defense, and she stated that although she knew that Mary was very violent, and the two had always kind of discussed attacking small children, both boys and girls, that Norma said she never touched Brian at all, and that she did admit, though, that she could have alerted some boys playing nearby in the vicinity at the time, but she just ran away instead. She also stated that she was never there with Martin Brown, that Mary had done that on her own, and then Mary had come and got her later and brought her to the scene to show her what she'd done, but then they stumbled upon John, given Martin CPR, so they were shooed away. So after Norma testified, Mary got on the stand in her own defense. So Mary would completely deny Norma's accusations and insist that she saw Martin Brown's body after the fact, that she didn't murder him. But when asked about Brian Howe, Mary stated that Norma had strangled him and that Mary just stood by and watched. And that she even saw Norma's fingertips while she was choking him turn white because of the force she was using. Yeah, that's some detail you don't think about. So it makes you question some things. Now, Norma's mother would end up taking the stand, and she stated that after Brian Howe's body was found a couple days later, that she and her husband had actually walked in on Mary strangling Norma's younger sister, Susan, and that she was just so focused and grabbing her neck that Norma's dad had to punch a 11-year-old girl in the shoulder to get her to let go of his daughter. So obviously Mary was doing it again. So in the closing arguments, Norma's attorney stated that besides Mary's, lies and accusations, that there was no real physical evidence, forensic evidence proof that Norma was responsible for either boy's death. When Mary's attorney went into closing arguments, he attributed Mary's, he would bring up Mary's dysfunctional family, her broken background, and she would just say that all this, in her defense, was just a childhood fantasy, that she really didn't kill the boys. She just bragged that she did because she wanted to scare the other children, that they were just childhood fantasies. My childhood fantasies were a lot different from Mary's. So the jury went to deliberate, and it took 9 days, and they finally came back. In the case of Norma, she was actually acquitted of all charges and wasn't held responsible for anything. When she heard this, she clapped her hands in excitement. When it came to Mary, the jury cleared her of murder, but convicted her of manslaughter due to diminished capacity. And when Mary heard this, she broke down and cried. The judge did agree that Mary was a danger to other children based on what he heard. And so she was sentenced to, detention and treatment at the Majesty's discretion, which is like an undetermined amount of time, or basically when they felt that she was rehabilitated, if ever. So in early 1969, Mary would be transferred to a secure children's home where she was actually the only female there out of 24 inmates. Now, while she was there, she stated that she was sexually assaulted by not only a staff member, but a lot of the inmates there as well. So when Mary turned 16, she was transferred to a prison for females. She didn't really like this prison, but she was there for a while. And then in 1976, when she was 19 years old, she was transferred to a minimum security prison, and she took this is where she would kind of get an education and take a secretarial course. In September 1977, she would end up escaping with another inmate from the minimum security prison. While she was out, she hooked up with a couple guys, and she kind of said she lived a life that she never lived before. Like, she had never gone to like a fair or an amusement park or anything like that, and she did all those things for the days that she was out. She was finally caught, and they brought her back to the prison, and her punishment for escaping was that she lost her prison privileges for 28 days. So by November 1979, Mary was actually on a work release program, and then she was eventually released from prison in May of 1980 after 11 and a half years of being incarcerated, and she was 23 years old. Now, at this time, she was granted anonymity and given a new name, allowing her to start a new life and kind of try to leave her past behind her. Then 4 years after Mary's release, she ended up having a daughter. However, in 1998, the media was able to track down Mary's new identity, and they went to her house and really started bugging her. And Mary's daughter was 14 years old at the time, and she had no idea of her mother's past at all. Well, this all came out, and now her daughter, knew about her mother's past. And both Mary and her daughter were forced to leave their home, and they were driven to a safe house by officers until they could be relocated somewhere else in the United Kingdom. Now, this anonymity right was extended to Mary's daughter until she was to turn 18. However, Mary did end up winning a court battle that her daughter could be kept under this clause and be anonymous for life in 2003. The court order was later updated in January of 2009 to include Mary's granddaughter. Now, this was the first for the United Kingdom to do something like this, to grant this anonymous thing for life to, this criminal. I mean, they probably never had any child criminals before now, but so now going forward, if this happens now and somebody's granted this anonymity for life, it's actually called a Mary Bell order. So after Mary was relocated, after the media found her, she collaborated with an author named Greta Sreni, and she wanted to create her account of what happened to her as a child leading up to these murders. I will put a link to the book in the description box. There was a lot of controversy around this book because the author paid Mary an undisclosed amount of money to do this. And the families of the victims were actually very outraged that Mary was able to make money from her crimes, which is understandable. Now, Mary's current whereabouts and her new name are unknown and remain protected by this 2003 High Court order. And according to the author of the book, Mary has never claimed that she was, wrongly convicted or anything, that through this treatment that she got while she was incarcerated, she freely now admits that the abuse she suffered as a child was no excuse of taking these two little boys' lives, which is the closest to a confession that you're going to get from Mary. As for Norma Bell, Mary's friend, there's nothing out there that I could find on her, so I assume that her family just did what they did to move on and never looked back. As far as Betty, Mary's mother, she would later give an interview to the press saying that, arguments between herself and William, the supposed father, were to blame for Mary's behavior. The arguments they got into, not the horrid abuse that she inflicted on Mary. So even though Betty would visit Mary off and on while she was incarcerated, their relationship was very strained, obviously. Mary would regularly write to Betty and plead for her to, just admit what she put Mary through as a child. Betty would never has ever admitted to any of the abuse or anything that Mary has claimed, and would even try to make money off of the whole thing. She started selling drawings and stuff that Mary did as a kid to people. When asked about Mary, Betty would respond with, well, she's Satan's child and she was born evil. Way to be Mother of the Year, Betty. So what are your thoughts on this case? I don't think Mary was born evil. Obviously, I think she was a product of her environment and very much learned behavior of at least her mother, if not her father or her stepdad, whichever. If she wasn't subjected to that abuse and that environment, she could have been just a normal little girl playing with her friends. And since Mary was 10 years old, 11 years old when all this happened, a lot of people don't feel that this whole anonymous clause that she's under, that shouldn't be a thing. But What do you think? I mean, she was 11 years old at the time. It's not like she was 20. I mean, I guess what gets me more is even at Mary's trial, they kind of knew that there was at least some abuse going on there, and Betty was never held responsible for any of that. And finally, Norma. Do you think Norma was this submissive little innocent bystander in all this, or did she maybe participate a little bit more than she led authorities to believe? So I'd love to hear what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to become a feline fan, please hit that join button and become a channel member for exclusive perks. And we will be back next Friday. I'm sorry I lost all the cats at this point. We got a delivery today and there's a bunch of empty boxes, so they chose boxes over the bed, and that's what cats do. So, sorry. Maybe next week they'll be right back by my side. So thank you guys. I will see you later. Bye.